I know what you're all saying. Where the heck is New Netherlands, right? Well, you're in it. New York is not part of New England because it was claimed by the Dutch. And if you don't think that's important, everyone who had coffee this morning instead of tea is because of New Netherlands. Now, the iconic landscape I talk about is the Helderberg Escarpment. It's a 3-mile-long cliff line escarpment 1,200 feet high out of the Hudson Valley, and it forms the core of Thacher State Park. Thacher Park, the cliffs were well known and treasured for a long time. It was used by Native Americans for hunting grounds. It was used by the Tories, loyalists to the English crown during the American Revolution as a hideout. And it was also studies there from scientists formed the basis of modern geology. It became popular with tourists in the 1900s, and in 1914 became John Boyd Thacher State Park. The park features many viewing areas and picnic areas built by the Civilian Conservation Corps, and it featured a huge pool built in the 50s. But by 2006, the pool had been demolished due to infrastructure problems, and attendance was really flagging. And then in 2010, the park was put on a list of planned closures due to budget deficit cuts. When that list became public, the community really rallied, and in the end, the park was saved. That reinvigorated energy for the park spurred the push for a new master plan. The focus of the master plan became to bring people's attention back to the cliffs that had spurred the park's development in the first place. During the planning efforts, we had a lot of people ask us to rebuild the pool, but pools are really expensive. They're not really used nearly as much as they used to be in the past, and due to the geology, any pool built up there would have the same problems the old pool would have and would form cracks and leaks. Plus, a pool is really part of the built environment, and the park is a park because of the cliffs. So we wanted to bring the focus back on the cliffs. That was the reason the park was there in the first place. So you're probably asking now, like, why is the natural resource steward asked to help? Oh, I'm sorry, I missed a part. We did have one group come to us with a new idea, which was rock climbing. So we were really excited about that. And so I was tasked from the park's perspective to help develop that rock climbing program. You might ask, why, as a natural resource steward, helping develop a rock climbing program? It's much more recreation-based. And you probably say, well, there's environmental issues, there's invasive species, native species that need to be accounted for, and you'd be right. But I'm also, believe it or not, the young, active guy at parks. Now, 40, I'm sure, is only really young when you're talking about like state middle management. But I do like to be active. I like hiking a lot. And my background in erosion control had already led to me being the backcountry trails coordinator for the region. I like to do mountain bike racing, triathlons. I really love trail running. I've done a couple trail ultras. And for this purpose, I'd actually been to a climbing gym before. So I was like way more experienced than anybody else. So I was going to tap with this. I also like to say that my title, Natural Resource Steward, is intentionally vague so that I can be responsible for just about anything that's like outside. So I was tasked with working out for them. So I reached out to the climbers. We started off with some initial meetings. And initially it was oddly confrontational. I don't think they were expecting us to be as interested in their idea as we were. But at the same time, they didn't understand the park and our constraints. They aren't park people, they're climbers. That's what they know. And so it was sort of my job and our job to let them know what our constraints were and how maybe we can incorporate their ideas into what we do at the park. But at the same time, we're not climbers. So I had to make sure that they understood that we wanted them to be the experts in climbing, and that together we can work to make this program a really great one for the park. So we started out with some initial scouting of the cliffs. I know this is a terrible picture, but we weren't really interested in documenting the scouting of each other that much. So I have lots of pictures of cliffs, not so many pictures of people. So we just started doing some joint scouting, and I think we really built a relationship just through those early interactions of getting out together. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure they understood was we were a willing partner, but there were a lot of constraints and a lot of challenges that we had to sort of face together. One is a challenge of perception. This is what a lot of people think rock climbing is all about, crazy people who don't care if they die. We also had challenges of access. There weren't that many people. Most of the park is just a cliff, and so we don't have a lot of ways to get down there. We had challenges of terrain. Once you do get down there, it's a 1,500-foot scree slope down to the valley, so it's just a really challenging place to build a trail. And then we had challenges of balancing recreation with other recreation. So this is the Indian Ladder Trail, and we had challenges of balancing with the natural resources and with other people in the park. So these were all challenges we felt like we could overcome, but we needed them to understand that. We needed them to work with us to overcome them. So that's when the climbing community really stepped up. They actually formed their own nonprofit, a registered nonprofit, the Thacher Climbing Coalition, with all kinds of committees and group outings and whatnot. And so this was really important step, in large part, to put our council's office at ease with that they were dealing with a legitimate group. So that was a really big step, and it was great that the climbers took that step. But there were a number of constraints at Thacher that we had to account for. The first thing is there's a lot of stuff going on the cliffs already. This is a view of the overlook. It's a 1,000-foot long overlook built by the Civilian Conservation Corps with views of Albany, downtown Albany, the Adirondack Mountains, and the Green Mountains of Vermont. The other major attraction at the park is the Indian Ladder Trail, which is the only trail that goes below the cliff face. But you can see it has these soaring cliffs. You go under multiple waterfalls. Both of these sites receive thousands of visitors on a busy day. And so those areas were deemed off limits for any kind of new climbing program. Additionally, this is a map of Thacher State Park. You can see the green. We don't own a lot of the cliffs at the base of the cliffs in a lot of areas. So we can't really give people access. The way our property boundaries worked, our property deed said that we owned to the top, our neighbors owned to the bottom. It didn't really say who owned the cliff itself. So we couldn't exactly let people climb those cliffs. Plus, we couldn't build the trails necessary to give people access at the bottom. So that was a major issue. And then we also had endangered species issues. The cliff was known for several different endangered species, one of which is smooth cliff break. We had seen it several places along the top of the cliff in sort of small amounts, but until this point, we didn't feel that we needed to go over the cliff to figure out where the plants were below the cliff, and we finally did. When we finally got down there, we found huge populations of smooth cliff break in certain areas, so that sort of cut off those areas for use by the climbers. And then the other big important endangered species issue at the park is actually here. This is Hale's Cave. It's a huge hibernacula for Indiana bat. So the Indiana bat is a federally endangered species that uses this cave as a place to hibernate over the winter. The climbers really wanted to come here, though. You can see it has huge cliffs, big overhanging roof systems that they want to climb on. But again, because of the bat issues, we had to work that out. Now, what we worked out was that the bats are actually inside the cave at their sensitive periods. We worked out with we were able to work it out with the state and federal officials that climbing here was possible, in part because we had, there's another view, I'm sorry, another view of the area around Hale's Cave. But this is the Indiana bat. We had built the other thing is, the Hale's Cave also has an unpopular distinction of being the place where white nose syndrome was first coined. That term, I don't know if you guys know that term or not, but white nose syndrome is a fungal ailment that has caused the die-off of over 90% of bats in the northeastern and beyond. And those Indiana bats are actually no longer at Hale's Cave, but the general die-offs have caused most of the other bats in the cave still to become on the endangered list as well. So we're still protecting the cave for the other bats. And to do so, we actually built a bat gate in the cave. It was this bat gate and assurances from the TCC that they would work with us to make sure that the climbing was prohibited during the bat hibernation period that allowed us to get the permissions from the state and federal officials that climbing outside the cave area was possible. And so the last major hurdle that we face is actually getting people to the climbs. In most situations, when a typical climbing, you walk up to the base of the cliff, you climb a cliff, you come back down, and you walk back home. Well, we're at the top of the cliff. This is the top of the cliff. Not only are we at the top of the cliff, so we got to figure out how to get people down, but you can see the top of the cliff is actually very crumbly and rounded edge. So normally you might throw a rope over for an anchor point. We couldn't do that. So we actually had to get people down the cliff, hiking. They'd hike back up to a spot, a top anchor, climb back down, then hike back out. And so figuring out where all these constraints worked out was really difficult. This is an example of how people, this is called top roping, and this is topping out. Those were not possible at Thacher Park. So I made up this map of Thacher Park and the cliff line and all the different constraints we had. Obviously, you can see there's areas where endangered species are an issue, where we don't own the base of the cliff, where recreational issues are a problem, where we can't have multiple recreation at the same place. One place did stick out, which was the north side of the park in that Horseshoe and Hales Cave area as a potential place for climbing. So that's where we focused our efforts. But getting people there was a trick. There was an access point. It was called Helms Crevice. This is a picture of it from undated picture, I'm guessing from the 60s. But it actually had been covered over since about the 70s with steel plates and soil. So most people didn't even realize it was there anymore. But you remember when I talked about the back gate that we built in Hales Cave? Well, for that project, we actually removed the first section of steel plates for access. Yeah, we carried 4,000 pounds of steel down through that gate, that crack, for the building of the back gate. I think that's why I don't really have a lot of sympathy for the climbers who complain about getting the ropes down there. So we built the back gate, and so here's another picture. You can see the steel gates, the steel plates up above in this picture. But that's Helms Crevice. It goes from about 4 feet at its widest to about 8 inches in a spot, 8 inches wide near the top. That's why most people know it as Fat Man's Misery. But we're PC at the state, so we went with the old name of Helms Crevice. So another factor about climbing here is this is traditional climbing, where people take these different devices and they stick them in the cracks in the rock, and that provides their anchor points. Because the rock at Thacher is limestone, it's kind of naturally soft, we felt that was unsafe. So what we went with is actually bolted climb. So we actually worked with the Thacher Climbing Coalition to bolt right into the rock face. This had two benefits. One was we were able to maximize safety, but we were also able to dictate where climbing happened, so that we could avoid environmental areas, specific environmental areas along that cliff, and also only allow climbing in areas where a decent trail was actually possible. Because the problem we had was once you come down Helms Crevice, the path basically hugged the base of the cliff. And that was a problem that worked fine for people who were just wandering through the park, but that wouldn't work for climbers because they needed this spot at the base of the cliff to belay their fellow climbers and to pay attention and to be active climbing. Having people walking through there all the time was really not a good thing. So this was a way for us to dictate exactly where people climbed, and Helms Crevice, Fat Man's Misery, was going to be basically the access point to that trail. The basic plan for the trail was to build down on the scree field, some distance, usually around 20 yards, down the scree field from the base of the cliff, and then have spur trails that would come up to the actual places where the cliff had been developed for climbing. So Helms Crevice is our access point, but we had another problem. Are people just going to get stuck? Are people just going to get stuck in this crack all the time? So we kind of weighed our options. One option we thought was to take the rest of the plates off because it gets wider out as you go further out the crack, and let people just climb down through that. But then it's a lot further, and then are people going to be too tired to climb back out? We thought about chiseling out the narrowest portion to make it easier, but we felt like if every time we chisel out, someone would just want it a little bit wider. And we also were warned by our counsel's office that if we chiseled it out, then we might be liable for any accidents that happen. So we kind of had to come up with a new idea. And I had been talking to our caving community, and they were telling me something about what they called the squeeze box, which was this device that they can alter the thickness of to see what kind of size crack they could fit through. So we thought, well, what if we flip that sideways 90 degrees and made that sort of like a litmus test for who could fit down through the crack? So this is really where the TCC first really shined. We gave them this basic idea, and they took it and they rendered this awesome gate for us. It's basically a squeeze box on its side. They did the map dimensions of the tightest spot of the Helms Crevice and made a gate. And now this is our new climbing area access point. Now, people can still obviously get down and try to go down that crack, but now no one can say they weren't warned. So when you get down, here's some pictures of the cliff. When you get down, you're still 30 feet to the bottom on this picture. I come down a crack here. This was basically the first iteration of the plan. You come down, and then you have these spur trails coming off. You can see the presumed climbs they had for the cave wall. And so this is what it looked like. You got down there. There were some herd paths, like I said, along the base of the cliff, but no one had bothered dealing with the scree path below, so we were the first ones to do that. And it was kind of crazy down there. But here's our basic trails plan that was developed early on. So you can see there's basically a main trail a little ways off the cliff, and then these short spur trails that would take you up to actual individual climbs. So once we had basically some scouting of the cliffs, the trails with the TCC, they went to work. They brought in tons of volunteers, thousands of hours of work on their own, and this wasn't easy work. Most of it required lots of rock work. You can see these are some of the cracks that we came down through originally with lots of stone steps. And a lot of times, this was the original of that same staircase. This is what it looks like now. They were able to bring in folks from the Access Fund, which is a national nonprofit aimed at making sure that people have access to climbing areas. They brought in the Access Fund's trail team to help them build some of these rock stairs. We brought in our own seasonal trails crew to combine our efforts with them, as well as the Excelsior Conservation Corps, a New York State initiative where they get really great training in trail building. So these are some of the trails that they developed. We quickly realized that it was so steep that building a typical backcountry trail wasn't even possible. So we actually developed sort of, I wouldn't say a new standard, but we laxed our standards because these trails are intended only for the climbers. So we kind of saw them as their own skill set, their own kind of abilities in climbing, and that a new standard was sort of warranted. And it was great because they did a ton of rock work, dealing with lots of wet seeps, building stone culverts, all kinds of great work. These are some pictures from their own trail days. And you can see this is the sort of typical trail that you'll find out there these days. They did a ton of work, and they were great partners. And there's also, the trail became a great way to get the mountains of trash that had been dumped over the cliff for decades. All told, in their first effort, they pulled out over 1,000 pounds of garbage, barrels, you name it, rotten picnic tables. It was a great side project for them, and it was really beneficial to the park. So this is sort of a view. You can see you have the main trail, and then you have the stem trails to the climbs. So if making the main trail was difficult, those stem trails are really, really difficult. You can see right now we're standing on, the camera's on where the main trail would be, and that's where they needed to get with that stem trail. It was up a really steep route, so mostly it's stone steps, and half the time it's just some rocks put on to make a scramble more reasonable. So in the end, we built only about a mile of trail, but really it was an amenity. It was more than just a mile. It was a tough mile, but it was more an amenity that we built. In the first, we've only been open for about a half a year. We've already brought in 800 different individual climbers have signed into the climbing area from 35 different states and 4 different countries. And so it's really awesome program that we built. But even more than a program, I think what we built was an example for how state parks can partner with like-minded groups to do something new and challenging, and to do something beyond what we normally do. And so a lot of people are really nostalgic for the picnicking era and these sort of big, broad lawn kind of eras of state parks, but a lot of people aren't doing that anymore. And so we really need to be able to reach out to new visitors and this sort of new era and new generation of environmentalists and conservationists. And we think our partnership with the Thacher Climbing Coalition is doing just that. Thank you very much.